and we'll address all those questions at the end. And go ahead and take it away, Emily.
Okay, I want to welcome everybody. I'm a member of Racial Justice Rising, and we welcome you to our RJR 2022 program series. Due to the pandemic, most of our programs will be online until everything is safe to meet in person again. We are starting the year off with a wonderful program with Allison Lau, the Code Pink coordinator for their campaign, Stop Asian Hate, China is Not Our Enemy. Anti-Asian sentiment and hate crimes against Asians in the US have been increasing since the beginning of the pandemic. And I ran across an alarming data that said anti-Asian hate in 2020 increased by 149%. Anti-Asian, Allison will help us to understand why this is happening with the complex situation with China. We do want to thank you all for joining us, and as well, the many local cultural councils who provide us with funds to make the programs possible. And these are Amherst, Asheville, Berniston, Buckman, Charlemont, Harley, Conway, Gill, Greenfield, Heath, Montague, New Salem, Northfield, Orange, Pelham, Rowe, Shelburne, Warwick, Wendell, and Whately. All these local cultural councils are supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. All our programs are free, but we do appreciate donations. And now I turn it over to Allison.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Fabulous. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison, as Emily said. Thank you for joining me on a Saturday. And thank you to Racial Justice Rising for inviting me here today. I'm the coordinator for the China is Not Our Enemy campaign at Code Pink, which is an anti-war campaign that aims to counter the US's aggression in China. You can check it out at codepink.org/China or at China Not Enemy on Twitter. I'm also the director of operations at Queer Toronto Literary Magazine. So a bit about me. I'm also an Asian American / Canadian. I was born in the Midwest in a sleepy suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. And after a few years, my Canadian parents relocated back to Toronto. So I've mainly grown up here, and that's where I am right now. But over the past few years, I've also worked and studied in Montreal, Quebec, as well as Manchester, England. When I was over in the UK, a flu-like virus in China first started to make headlines. Some of the first memories I have of being in Toronto are playing in my kitchen whilst the news was on in the background, and listening to what I now realize are hospitalization and death figures from SARS. Outside of Asia, Toronto was one of the hardest hit areas in the world. I was far too young back then to take in the gravity of the situation and the anti-Asian racism that was accompanying it. But in 2020, I was, and not to age myself too much, in my mid-20s. So I understood what was happening when COVID started to spread. I understood how, sort of the non-Asian people in my own circle were starting to avoid Chinatown in Manchester, that people were vandalizing Chinese-owned businesses in North America, that Asian businesses and individuals were suffering. And I saw this marked shift within my own community and the East and Southeast Asian diasporic communities in general, because we had experienced the pandemic of SARS and racism not so long ago before. And I was concerned for my family's safety as well. But anti-Asian racism and xenophobia were not invented with the outbreak of SARS in the early 2000s, nor did they emerge spontaneously. In fact, American narratives of China today whilst different in their content, mirror the kind of discourse that developed over a century ago when Chinese immigrants first landed in the US and Canada. Tropes of the threat of Chinese encroachment, their limitless power, them being uncivilized or immoral, their economic and social threat due to their large population, the spreading of diseases, these were born from the first depictions of Chinese laborers in the 19th century. So let's start out with a little bit of a history lesson. Like the work of Racial Justice Rising, I don't think we can take on what's happening now without acknowledging and learning about the past. Like with other forms of racism in America, anti-Asian racism didn't emerge spontaneously in modern life. And xenophobia is in fact quite foundational and of early American history. Throughout a series of racist narratives and legislation, we have arrived at today's context. By understanding how these have embedded themselves within political, economic, social, healthcare, justice, spatial, and other systems, we can see how anti-Asian racism and xenophobia are structural issues and approach it as such in addressing and resisting it. So in the 1850s, when Chinese immigrants first touched down on North American soil, many of them fleeing the instability of the Opium Wars and their after effects, there has been a pervasive fear of the foreignness of Chinese bodies and Chinese cultures. This has, and their large population, the potential for imperialist invasion and conquest, with Chinese people seen as a threat to the relatively homogeneous white national identity back then. You may know this more colloquially as yellow peril, which is the scapegoating of Chinese people for a variety of social ills. For instance, the unfulfilled promise of prosperity with westward expansion and the outbreaks of disease. Like other racist and xenophobic sentiments, it called for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants who were deemed undesirable or un-American for their purported threats. These beliefs are rooted in white supremacy and were built on a foundation of moral duality, good versus evil, pure versus dirty, us versus them. These ideas are foundational to social structures that are dependent on the maintenance of boundaries. Therefore, any sort of deviation from the norm, in this case, white America, was seen as dangerous, threatening, and disruptive because it puts the social system in disorder or in ambiguity. Often, this is expressed as nationalism. There's three areas of threat that seem to be particularly pervasive in these early narratives of Chinese immigrants back in the 19th century. So the first, as you can see on the screen right now, is the moral threat of Chinese immigrants and Chinese culture and how what it posed to Americans in America. For instance, Song Hee-kil, a scholar activist at the Department of Justice Studies at San Jose State University, wrote an article on the racialization of purity versus danger. Kil examines these constructions of Chinese people in the San Francisco Chronicle during the year of 1882, and it was the leading paper in California at the time, and San Francisco was a major port of Chinese immigration. She found 7 themes in the construction of Chinese people: coolie slave, cruel murderers, evil heathens, i.e. non-Christians, celestial invaders, overwhelming deluge, with comparisons to natural disasters such as floods, and uncivilized assimilator and diseased filth. One of the running threads through each of these constructions was the idea of a threat or being outside of the natural moral structure, in particular, the idea of criminals, predators, outside of traditional family structures, especially since most of the immigrants were men and not women. It wasn't just the San Francisco Chronicle, however. Chinese immigrants having no will to assimilate was a prominent theme in early depictions, that Chinese people clung to antiquated or outdated traditions, or their vices like prostitution, opium, and gambling. Because of this, their morality was seen as corrupt or inferior to white Christianity, and therefore a threat to the moral purity of white America at the time. Health officials, for instance, framed Chinatown as a great reservoir of moral, social, and physical evil, even describing an alley in Chinatown as defying all civilization. So the second threat was that the Chinese seemed to pose at the time, and it offers a materialist perspective on why they were seen so threatening, was their labor. In the themes that Kale found in the San Francisco Chronicle, the sheer number of Chinese immigrants was threatening. In characterizations like coolie slaves displacing white workers, invaders, and comparisons to floods, there was a decline in opinion of Chinese people in the mid-19th century associated with the increase in Chinese immigration. Chinese labor threatened the tradition of white paid labor because they were open to lower wages. There was a threat of sort of this limitless Chinese labor equated with limitless Chinese power. Beyond competition, the claim that the Chinese worked without giving back to the economic system that paid for their wages. And whilst many Chinese men sent their money back home to their families in China, my family included, they also contributed back. My great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather came to Canada a little bit later than this time, and they did make money that some they sent back to their families. However, they did service work and domestic work, such as laundries and shoe shining, that allowed society at the time to function. Chinese labor, like the men that are in this picture here, were instrumental in building the transcontinental railway across America. So it's not as though this labor didn't benefit American society in any way. And there's a strange tension to note between the political rhetoric that Chinese workers were somehow inferior in nature, they were servile or morally inferior, with the complicated racial anxiety that Chinese workers were too successful or even, quote, machine-like in comparison to white labor, and abetting the capitalists in further exploiting the working class. Rather than seeing this as a failure of the socioeconomic structure or mobilizing together for fairer wages, these Chinese workers were viewed as a threat to the familiar structure and security of American jobs. So the third threat was the Chinese immigrants with disease and filth. Chinese people were scapegoated for the outbreaks of things like bubonic plague and smallpox. This stemmed from three Orientalist beliefs. First, the imagination that China was the origin of disease, such as the 1894 Hong Kong outbreak of the bubonic plague, which captured global attention. Second was that of the Chinese as an inferior race, and therefore somehow biologically more susceptible to infection and transmission of disease. So the Chinese were disparaged as both the people who brought over disease and as spread it in America. Thirdly, this linked to the idea of morality, that the Chinese culture and spaces were also inferior and therefore allowed disease to proliferate. Americans viewed Chinese culture as well as the medical paradigm as stagnant, antiquated, and didn't emphasize hygiene the way that Western medicine did. But unhygienic conditions were not unique to Chinatown. For example, Frederick Ingalls published The Conditions of the Working Class in England a few years later in 1885, calling the neighborhood that I lived in when I lived in Manchester, quote, hell on earth. As a city that boomed in the Industrial Revolution, much of Manchester became worker slums with massive overcrowding and mortality from diseases like smallpox, measles, and scarlet fever at much higher than the national average. Underneath the park that I used to hang out with my friends lies 40,000 bodies of people who had no family or couldn't afford a proper burial. So this was part of a broader trend of this idea of eugenics in that era that blamed poor living conditions and crime on old world cultures, not the poverty and inequality driven by industrialization and unequal development. These types of arguments were lobbied against other ethnic and racial groups, such as Africans, including African Americans, Japanese, Koreans, Indians, Italians, Russians, and Jewish people, with proponents saying that these groups' presence degraded and threatened the stability of the entire social system. In many ways, these are a relic of the colonial past that created a hierarchy of races in order to justify European control and exploitation. So the problem with this racist characterization isn't just the racist tropes that resulted from them. This discourse then fed and justified Asian exclusion, violence, and imperial expansion in Asia Pacific. The first piece of legislation was the Page Act of 1875. This cleverly resisted Asian immigration without explicitly restricting immigration based on race. Exclusion was instead based on labor perceived as immoral or coerced, authorizing federal agents to search boats arriving from Asia to search for immigrants who had either come involuntarily or for lewd or immoral purposes. In practice, it banned Chinese women from immigration due to the perception that all Chinese women were promiscuous or prostitutes, and therefore sexually immoral, i.e. a threat, and helped to codify the sexualization of Asian women that still persists today. This demonstrates the intersectionality of racism, classism, and sexism in policy. The biggest and probably most famous piece of anti-Chinese legislation was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Look at this racist cartoon from that supported the Exclusion Act. This act initially barred Chinese immigration for 10 years and made Chinese people ineligible for naturalization, i.e. they couldn't become citizens. By 1902, Chinese immigration was illegal, and by 1924, the Immigration Act extended restrictions to immigration from other Asian countries. The Exclusion Act was a watershed moment because it was the first time that in US policy, the first US policy that stopped immigration based on race and nationality, and it became a blueprint for the exclusion of other racist groups from racial groups from entering the US. Before it was signed, the Chinese already had to register and carry an identification at all times. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until the mid-20th century, so not that long ago at all. I should note here that this policy wasn't unique to the US. Canada also had a white Canada forever rhetoric. When Canada's Chinese head tax, which exclusively charged Chinese immigrants, didn't curb immigration, the Canadian government implemented the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, which wasn't repealed until 1967. If we remember back to the constructions of the Chinese I was just talking about, these pieces of legislation are rooted in the fear of threat, of moral corruption, and of limitless Chinese immigration consuming the US as well as Canada, and is reflected in this cartoon, I think. The racist belief that Chinese people were the cause and spreaders of disease was so ingrained that in San Francisco's Chinatown, Chinese were routinely subject to inspections and punitive measures such as fumigations and quarantine in Chinatown, to which white people were not subject to, and they were even denied access to medical care. The Tonghua dispensary in Chinatown was founded in 1900 in response and was an early model of community-based healthcare, provided low cost or free services to patients who couldn't afford it, with access to both Western physicians and traditional medicines. But legislation wasn't the only place that Chinese people were discriminated against. Anti-Chinese violence was also rife. Beth Lou Williams, a Princeton history professor, found that between 1885 and 87, there were 86 Chinese people killed and more than 168 forced or attempted evictions in Chinese communities in LA alone. The 1871 Chinese Massacre was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. On October 24th, 1871, a white police officer was injured and a civilian shot during a dispute between two Chinese parties. In response, 500 rioters stormed downtown LA and indiscriminately attacked Chinese people. Nearly 20 Chinese bodies were found, amounting to about 10% of LA's Chinese population at the time, which is massive. And not a single person was held accountable. This massacre is often forgotten within the pages of history, but is absolutely chilling. So Chinese immigration and labor, as well as xenophobia, were actually much more integral to American history and politics, especially immigration policy, than were often taught in dominant narratives. The way that Americans have viewed Chinese people has been shaped by this Orientalist view that Chinese people are less civilized than Westerners, so much so that their existence is a direct threat to the American values and systems. And structural and historic violence has often been the response. So what about today? And what does that look like now? I think this is a little bit easier to answer because, we're living in it and it's easier to see. I still think there's a tendency to focus on this duality of us versus them, good versus bad, etc. when we're talking about China. In particular, there's a tendency to other China and Chinese people and portray China as less civilized than the West. So let's walk through the three areas of threat that I talked about earlier in reference to the original Yellow Peril in America, and see how things have changed or haven't. So the first is the question of morality. I believe this is most aptly summed up in this unquestioned view of China as a repressive autocracy and Chinese people as repressed. There's this juxtaposition of regime types, American-style democracy versus Chinese autocracy, that is foundational to the idea that Chinese are sort of inferior. By moralizing a people and problems as an extension or product of the regime type, is problematic because not only is it orientalizing, but it's a bit of a misrepresentation of what's actually happening. So China scholar Yun Ong labeled this conceptual fallacy a false binary when speaking at the Camden Convention. She argues there's this sort of insistence that either countries are a democracy, i.e. the US, or an autocracy, basically wrong. So there are autocracies that have democratic qualities, and there are also democracies with illiberal qualities. It's not just one or the other. Not only is this false binary misleading, it also flattens a wide range of regime types into just two categories, including the different eras of modern China through Mao, Deng, and Xi, and into one unitary category. It also fails to capture the dynamism of regimes, such as the political reforms that Deng-era China undertook with its strategy for economic development. And Ong concludes that China's power and recent development lies not in its brute force, but in its flexibility. And Cheng Li's book, Middle Class Shanghai, also supports this claim. His study challenges the Western caricature of the Chinese state as monolithic, a monolithic communist apparatus determined to export its ideology and development model, and also points to the dynamism and diversity within China. And like Ong, Li concludes policymakers need to consider the flexibility of the country. In an Atlantic article, Yang Chen argues the binary is a, quote, a product and tool of geopolitics. China has become a foil, the embodiment of authoritarian evil eroding American freedom, end quote. Like Ong, Cheng warns against this dichotomous thinking that she admits she fell into upon first moving to the US. In blurring the lines between democracy and non-democracy, she points to how freedom of speech has been used to protect people from the consequences of their speech and fails to take into consideration power asymmetries such as gender, race, and sexuality. She also points to the contradictions with recent resistance to critical race theory and other, quote, divisive topics being taught in schools and university within recent political debates, and compares this to the criticisms of Beijing's censorship. Beyond the state, there is also a tendency to view Chinese people exclusively as repressed. This has been used to both other and dismiss Chinese people as brainwashed nationalists rather than as individuals with their own opinions, lived experiences, and viewpoints. There is a tendency to frame the Chinese political system as a shorthand for Chinese culture and values. Autocracy or authoritarianism becomes the cause of everything that happens to its people and as an inseparable part of China. Again, this underlying fear of Chinese corrupting American morality through political or intellectual influence. Instead of clinging to antiquated or outdated traditions that threaten modern social structures, it's now stagnant Chinese authoritarianism that threatens American liberal democracy, a fear of non-assimilation into the Western political order instead of just American society. By deviating from the Euro-American political tradition that stems from Enlightenment thinking and Christianity, the Chinese state is viewed as anti-human nature or even anti-human. So the second threat in the original tale of Yellow Peril is fear of the decline of white American laborers. Similarly today, China's economic rise is inducing fears of decline in America. According to the World Bank, in 1990, America's gross national income per person was 70 times higher than China. But by 2019, this gap had narrowed. The US's gross national income per person was only 6 times higher than China's. China's rapid industrialization, urbanization, and emerging middle class have intensified economic competition at the global level. Overwhelming or limitless is still sort of associated with this idea of Chinese economic power. but this time more specifically by Chinese companies and the limitless Chinese people. Meanwhile, China as the factory of the world draws parallels to Chinese workers as machine-like in the 19th century. Again, there's this strange tension between China being too good at working, yet being inferior workers. For instance, modern day Western media, such as Forbes, brings us stories of, humiliation and bizarre punishments of underperforming employees in China. Yet the commonality of workers' struggles driven by the corporate need to increase profits turns into a story about cruel Chinese work culture, which divides solidarity that workers might feel across borders. Because horrible working conditions aren't unique to China, right? Take the industry-wide problem of Amazon drivers in North America having to urinate in bottles because they can't take a break or find a bathroom. This is also, bizarre and humiliating as well. And we should reserve the same outrage in both situations. There is also a lot about China's economic development that we don't hear about in the West. Numbers suggest that China has lifted nearly 800 million people out of extreme poverty since 1980, primarily through economic growth, economic reforms, and administrative choices such as the expansion of public infrastructure that has helped integrate rural economies. Code Pink ran a campaign, which you see a screen grab of right here, to reinstate a documentary called Voices from the Front Line that was co-produced by PBS SoCal and then removed by PBS. This documentary explored how poverty alleviation happened. Omissions and this documentary from the public narrative create two-dimensional constructions of China's economic and political systems as uniformly bad and fail to capture their dynamism and other aspects of them. So as I spoke about at the beginning of my speech, if you can still remember that, anti-China rhetoric around COVID and SARS has been one of the most visceral ways that China has been othered and vilified in recent years. Think about abandoning Chinatown businesses during SARS, Trump's China virus tweets, which shored up anti-Asian sentiment, calling it the Kung flu, the Wuhan flu, etc. So this is sort of the idea of Chinese as diseased or dirty continued. One common theme we've seen emerge has been this idea of the masked Chinese. Media stories covering the virus, particularly in Asia, are often accompanied by images of a Chinese person stood in a face mask with sort of a dystopian looking backdrop. The relatively quick uptake of and the continued use of face masks as a method of both self-protection and protection of others in China and other Asian nations from the airborne disease of SARS and then COVID again, has given the face mask a particular visual significance in the imagination of disease control and Asian culture. This has been reinforced in popular media, such as the cover of The Economist with Mao in a face mask and the Time magazine cover of Xi Jinping in a face mask that you can see on your screen right now. But as COVID has impacted the Western world to a greater degree than SARS, face mask mandates have been implemented. Toronto has had one in place since summer 2020, for example. Many of you have probably worn face masks for probably the first time in the past 2 years. I didn't wear one during SARS. I'm sure most people didn't wear one during SARS. There's an important variation to how xenophobia, though, has developed from now and the original Yellow Peril, which was outlined in a paper published in the Journal of Medical Humanities by a Columbia student and researcher, Dennis Zhang. There's been a flip. In the original era of Yellow Peril, Chinese people were seen as not only having a greater propensity for disease, but that their antiquated cultural practices were dirty and backwards, causing an increased risk of infection and spread. And whilst there's still a tendency to view China as the origin of disease and Chinese bodies as spreaders of infection, Zhang points out the images of a mask represents a different narrative. Rather than practices that lag behind modern medicine and technology, masks represent a Chinese embrace of technology and scientific discovery. Through masks, though masks were not invented for disease control by the Chinese, for instance, like the iconic bird mask of the 17th century plague in Europe, Zhang argues this has challenged the Chinese imagination of Chinese culture as a rejection of modernity. And the narrative has shifted towards an anxiety of the Chinese exploiting that very modernity. This has given legitimacy to various theories, such as the infamous lab leak theory, or that COVID was somehow a Chinese bioweapon. Zhang then links these changing perceptions of the decline of the Qing Empire in the 19th century and China's rise as a global power today. Linking back to the idea of politics, China has been vilified as repressive or draconian for implementing disease control measures that other Western nations have adopted, such as lockdowns and curfews. Toronto, for instance, was in one of the longest lockdowns in North America and perhaps the world last year, from December 2020 to June 2021. And, I was going crazy by April. Our French neighbors in Quebec are currently under a 10 p.m. curfew at the moment. And ironically, in the West, there has been a shift towards resistance of science and technology that the Chinese were vilified for in the original Yellow Peril narrative. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the anti-mask, anti-lockdown, or anti-vaccine protests that have gone on across metropolitan areas, with many comparisons of these measures to tyranny. The trucker envoys are currently wreaking havoc in Canada and unfortunately are in Toronto at this very moment. I think Zhang lays out a very compelling argument, but I also think there's one continual thread that links these two different narratives, and that's the dehumanization of Chinese people and their deviation from the norm. In both cases, Chinese or Chinese culture was portrayed as foreign and bad, with the underpinning theme of disease as an existential threat to America stemming from that. How American media has framed this has certainly changed as the context has evolved. Because COVID-19 and the racism that emerged in response are sort of like a peephole into larger systems at play, I think at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, China hasn't really been that much of a part of how COVID has played out in America, and yet violence and discrimination still persists. So where else is this racial anxiety coming from? I think as China rises, American political and economic elites are starting to feel threatened with the challenge to the US's unipolar or exclusive hegemony or dominance on the global stage. Remember the early stages of his campaign for the White House, Donald Trump called China an economic enemy. With this anxiety, it's easy to play on old tropes of China as deviant in order to shore up anti-China sentiment. By erasing how these narratives emerged and developed, as well as erasing the contributions that Chinese people have made to American history, it naturalizes these anti-Chinese beliefs that buttress policy. Basically, they feel like these age-old or primordial truths. In the description of this webinar, we've used the term hybrid war to sort of describe what US foreign policy looks like. This is a useful term to capture US aggression against China, but it feels a little bit opaque, right? I imagine many of you have not heard this term, or if you have, perhaps you aren't really familiar with what it means. So in the most basic terms, hybrid war is sort of a broad term used to describe conflict that is in many ways like a Cold War. It's indirect, often below the threshold of armed militarized violence. It may also be framed in ways like unconventional warfare, war outside conventional theaters of war, implemented through means of influence such as propaganda or political warfare through soft power. One of the more prominent ways this plays out in American foreign policy is the way that it treats the China question as this sort of zero-sum situation, i.e. China's gains are at America's losses and vice versa. This is a really dualistic way of thinking though, right? Like about both global development and cooperation, and justifies an aggressive stance against China and Chinese people. However, most interactions aren't zero-sum because they can benefit both parties in some way. And in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world, this is increasingly true. So if you think about global vaccine distribution, for instance, not only is it helping the recipient country, but it also stops the further spread and mutation of the virus that's causing a global pandemic. So it's not just one or the other. This is also true for opinions of countries. Outside of the US, public opinion polls indicate that there's no correlations between the opinions on the US and China, i.e., as your opinion of the US improves, your opinion of China doesn't concurrently diminish necessarily. And whilst more respondents see China playing a bigger role than it did 10 years ago, most also don't see the US playing a smaller role than it did 10 years ago. And you can sort of see some of the data from the responses on the pink side of your screen. Similarly, in an Afrobarometer study, which you can see on the green side of your screen, attitudes on China's influence in Africa, this survey found that among its African respondents, positive attitudes towards the US and China's influence on the continent were similar and, positively correlated. So if respondents positively thought about the US and Africa, they were also likely to think positively about China and Africa. So rather than a zero sum, these surveys that show that you can actually think positively or not positively about both, and it's not really a competition between opinions. So what are the implications? There are many ways in which this aggression manifests in American foreign policy as well as domestic policy and behaviors, including how to address or fix these threats. Economic aggression has taken place in the forms of trade wars, especially escalating during the Trump administration. See sanctions, tariffs, attacks on Chinese-owned companies. TikTok was one of the big ones that we saw during Trump's administration. And unfortunately, the impacts of sanctions are often felt by ordinary people. And the US's sanctions aren't really that likely to make Chinese officials more willing to engage with American demands or American wants, right? And last June, the Innovation and Competition Act was passed with bipartisan support in the Senate. This bill took an aggressive warlike stance against China, one that is likely to escalate tensions and increase the likelihood of either an accidental or intentional combat by increasing the military budget, military posturing, troop deployment, military exercises, and weapon sales to countries around China in the Indo-Pacific. And if you see on the right side of your screen, we ran a campaign at Code Pink for this. This bill also explicitly pits American innovation and competitiveness as a zero-sum game against China's. It very much echoes the sentiment of China exploiting modernity and technology that I discussed in that anxiety around the masked Chinese. Just yesterday, the America Competes Act, which you can see on the other side of your screen, was passed quietly in the House. And it was their answer to the Innovation and Competition Act. In the context of a semiconductor shortage, both bills addressed semiconductor research, competition with China, building resilient supply chains, and revitalizing American manufacturing and production. Semiconductors, or chips, are used in thousands of products, from computers to smartphones, appliances, medical equipment, military equipment, to even cars. So they're really, really important. These bills also increase military spending. And although the linchpin of Competes is economic and manufacturing investment, the bill is framed as a way to combat or outcompete China. This zero-sum approach, i.e. the US wins in innovating in manufacturing when the Chinese lose, feels an awful lot like the Cold War rhetoric we saw in the 20th century. Look at how national security and competition forms the messaging around the Competes bill, with some Republicans arguing this bill doesn't go far enough militarily. Yet the military and Department of Defense are direct beneficiaries of this bill. The DoD receives $2 billion to establish private-public partnerships to incentivize the formation of one or more consortia to ensure the development and production of microelectronics, and authorizes $225 million over 5 years to the State Department for international military education and training programs. And so just for a little bit of context, the US spent about 778 billion US dollars on its military in 2020. That's more than the next 11 countries' military budgets combined in the same year. So that's like a lot of money. In terms of other policies, in academia, the Department of Justice's China's initiative was designed to crack down on intellectual theft and espionage within US universities. This initiative was created by the Trump administration and carried on under Biden. There's no clear definition of what would constitute a case, and details aren't clear. Most researchers and academics who have been charged or investigated have been accused of concealing ties with China. Civil rights groups have been concerned since the start of this, and members of Congress and academics from universities across the US are calling for its abolition, criticizing it for racially profiling academics such as Gong Cheng, whose article you can see here, as well as others such as An Minghu and Qing Wang. All charges were dropped against these three academics. There have also been reports of US consular offices vetting Chinese graduate students while they were trying to obtain visas to attend US universities. This follows from a general concern that young Chinese people, including students studying at American University, are being used as weapons by the Chinese state to undermine US power and interests or commit espionage, as well as fears of the Chinese Communist Party's influence on campus. These politics deter academic exchange, again perpetuating a zero-sum attitude in research and scientific discovery, as though researchers can't produce research and create innovations that benefit both countries. And more importantly, these policies dehumanize Chinese people as mere tools of the CCP and fuel racist suspicion and racial profiling. Academics are being targeted due to their ethnicity or nationality, with MIT Technology Review showing that 88% of the individuals charged under the China Initiative have been academics and scientists of Chinese heritage. So that's like an overwhelming majority. Also, media and information is another way that aggression is carried out, from the way that we frame China in COVID discourse to the misinformation on the Chinese state. But this isn't always flat out aggression. Sometimes it's a space where microaggressions happen, for instance, where racist stereotypes of Chinese people are perpetuated. These images and tropes can be exploited and amplified when vilifying Chinese people. One particular way that the media does so is by erasing the diversity of Chinese people, both in China and in the diaspora, like myself, through the refusal to see Chinese people as individuals with our own dreams, aspirations, and desires, rather portraying Chinese people in China as two-dimensional caricatures with little to no nuance, like termites, for example, that you can see in this picture. And impacts of these decisions and policies are felt domestically by Chinese and Chinese Americans and Chinese nationals in America, as well as people who just look Chinese. In other words, ordinary people. A study from California State University, San Bernardino compared anti-Asian hate crimes reported in the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2021 and saw a 164% increase from 2020. You can see a little graphic of it here, city by city. They also found that in Canada, where I live, anti-Asian hate crimes rose in the 4 of the nation's biggest cities by 532% in 2020. The largest increase was in Vancouver, British Columbia, which saw a 717% increase in 2020 from 2019, which is huge. Recently, the San Francisco police reported a 567% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes reported in 2021 from 2020 in San Francisco. And the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism reported a 339% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes reported. This indiscriminate violence against anyone who looks Chinese is a painful reminder that the violence that happened in the 19th century that I talked about earlier is still happening nearly 150 years later. Last year, with so many attacks against Asian seniors, my family was afraid for my 89-year-old grandmother to go out as she lives downtown, and her and her friends would tell each other to stay safe. It was heartbreaking, particularly with the generational fracture of immigration. So much of our culture and our language is preserved through our elders. So when they're attacked, it's particularly harmful and painful to the rest of the community. And also my grandmother's adorable and I love her and I would hate to see anything happen to her. And then of course, there was the Atlanta spa shootings, which made headlines last March, when a man shot and killed 8 people, including 6 Asian women, at spas and massage parlors where the staff are mainly Asian women. Police said it wasn't a hate crime and originally just said the shooter was, quote, having a bad day. Perhaps it was because this narrative fell into a larger US narrative that has long sexualized Asian women, particularly for the pleasure of white men. For me and my Asian girlfriends, this week was particularly hard. I was angry and sad and afraid. The collective pain and loss was something felt so deeply within the community. We were all in mourning, and it really, really sucked. But this also plays out in an American tendency and Western tendency more broadly to feel a greater sympathy for Chinese people being repressed by the Chinese state than there is for Chinese people within their own borders being discriminated against and subjected to violence by both their own state and their own people. For example, there was both sympathy and outrage when the death of Li Wenliang, the whistleblower doctor who had warned colleagues about a novel source of pneumonia in 2019. Yet there was not a similar sort of outrage necessarily about the Asian healthcare workers like doctors and nurses who were being harassed, attacked, and abused whilst they were responding to the pandemic in America. Again, this is the othering of the China problem, moralizing autocracy as the root of all problems. At the same time, we see how Asian people within our own borders are seen as perpetual foreigners and a vague threat. This isn't to say that non-Asian American people don't feel sad or moved by instances of anti-Asian and anti-Chinese violence and hate crimes. I'm sure you read the stories and felt deeply empathetic for our community, particularly if you are also a racialized person. But what we've been taught in schools, by the media, by our own politicians, hides how the greater threat of China discourse is directly impacting how Chinese and those who look Chinese are being treated at home. The US narrative that China and its people are inherently a moral, political, economic, and health threat to the US, continuing a narrative that has been constructed since the 19th century, creates a climate where anti-Asian violence is not only permissible, but a logical or protective step. While media sources propagate particular anti-China narratives, they then publish outrage on the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, missing how those two are in fact linked. It reproduces what the US is doing in its foreign policy at the interpersonal level. As Professor Russell Zheng, who is the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, said last year, when America China bashes, then Chinese get bashed, as do those who look Chinese. American foreign policy in Asia is American domestic policy for Asians. So what can we do about it, right? After that giant dump of information I've given you, what are the next steps? I think the first important thing we can do is educate ourselves, because knowledge is power and the tools to start countering racist violence, racist control, and white supremacy. And it starts with things like this webinar. So, give yourself a pat on the back for this, especially giving up your Saturday afternoon and morning to learn. We have to approach both countries with nuance when we're educating ourselves. The Chinese state is far from perfect, but so is the US. I think a good point to start from is being open to listening to legitimate critiques, but with critical thinking, always asking ourselves, who does this narrative serve? And if I act on this knowledge, who does that serve? This comes from a very important principle of challenging nationalism. Bad policies are both in the US and China impact ordinary people, and we should hold them accountable for their actions and policies. I think this really stems from challenging the idea that morality of a country stems from the country that you belong to. And this is a challenge for everyone, not just Americans, and certainly not just in the context of China-US relations. In times of crisis, perceived decline or disruption, people often fall into the trap of increased nationalism with a heightened reliance on demarcation of self-other boundaries to reassert a sense of identity, almost like self-preservation, right? This often relies on tropes that feel primordial and age-old and blames ills and problems of the society on the others, like I've talked about throughout my presentation. So as this crops up, I think we need to challenge it. The position of zero-sum competition upheld by both the Trump and Biden administrations fuels this nationalism, actually on both sides. In the US, China is constructed as a foreign enemy threatening US livelihoods. And the US's aggression on China can be constructed in China as an enemy foreign enemy threatening Chinese people's livelihoods, inflaming nationalism on both sides. So when we start to understand these processes, I think the connection with the exclusion of other racial and ethnic groups becomes a lot clearer, because it's not just unique to Chinese experience or America's treatment of Chinese people. If we think about the horrible detention centers at the US-Mexico border, how the war on drugs was fueled by racist fear-mongering, post 9/11 Islamophobia, and all the violence against Black and Brown people that have resulted as from these sentiments and policy choices, racism is built into America's foundations. We also have to challenge the xenophobic and racist narratives, as well as any racist narratives that pathologize these as uniquely Chinese or as a result of Chinese culture. Think back to when I talked about the repression as intrinsic to the Chinese experience, or that the one-party state is a stagnant, unchanging entity, all framed with this sort of lack of civilization. For instance, I don't think that anyone is under the impression that China is developing or making decisions that aren't in its own interests. However, that isn't characteristic that is exclusive to the Chinese one-party state, right? States and America were developing in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, they were primarily focused on their own interests. And, they largely still are today. Two examples are US's historical protectionism as a method of economic development and growth, more contemporarily Brexit, right? Through educating ourselves and challenging this narrative, I think comes with acknowledging that there's a diversity of people who are ethnically Chinese, both in China and in the diaspora, like myself. We're all individuals with our own lives, beliefs, and personhood. And this comes with unflattening the term Asian, which is often conflated with Chinese or East Asian, to the erasure of other ethnic and cultural diversity within the Asian diaspora. Each country has a unique history and relationship with colonial and imperial powers, exclusion in and immigration to the US. And I think when we do this, we challenge the dehumanization of Asian people, particularly the one that denies us diversity and dynamism, because no country and its people are unchanging nor uni-experiential, right? Instead of creating caricatures of Chinese people, we have to allow for nuance. The next thing we need to do is challenge the narrative that China is a looming threat to the US, beginning with dismantling this false idea that everything is binary. According to the World Bank, in 2020, China had about 1.4 billion people and the US had 329.5 million people. That's like a lot of people, right? Even in this space today, at kernels compared to that, I think there's immense diversity even within us. So challenging China as a threat begins challenging that unitary perception and also challenging that global power is a zero-sum situation and that multipolar world is inherently bad. This sort of perception stymies opportunities for cooperation and encourages aggressive, hawkish foreign policy. This is the narrative that there are two diametrically opposing types of government, like I talked about earlier. It misdirects our attention away from the root causes of major and existential problems such as COVID. When we first heard about COVID in the Western world, there was a tendency to sort of dismiss it as, a non-autocratic Western states would be sort of immune to it. Then we continued to blame China for failure to control the virus, or that it manufactured the virus and had a lab leak, even 2 years later, when the domestic situation where COVID is killing Americans at a far higher rate than any other wealthy nation is related to American policy failure and poor leadership. The threat is thus not concentrated in a foreign state power, but actually also within domestic decision-making, which I think is really empowering because we as American citizens have influence in this domain and can change this reality. This can begin with pressuring our representatives to stop hawkish bills from passing through the Senate and the House, particularly ones that are being touted as pandemic recovery and national security, and instead endorse bills that would actually benefit the people, such as Build Back Better. I would urge you all to look into the America Competes bill that was passed yesterday in the House and contact your representatives if, like me, you were concerned about the implications of these bills. We still have time to influence, as there's negotiations happening to reconcile the House and Senate bills before they're placed on the president's desk. Following from this, we must pressure the government into recognizing systemic and structural discrimination and end policies that reinforce the zero-sum approach. Recently, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, with the oldest Chinatown in the US, approved a resolution to apologize to Chinese immigrants and their descendants for the systemic and structural discrimination and targeted acts of violence that they experienced. Antioch was the first to offer a formal apology in May, followed by San Jose in September and Los Angeles in October. Whilst this trend is important and should be continued, it doesn't offer much in terms of material change. So this continued link between American foreign policy in Asia and the treatment of Asians in America cannot be forgotten. Instead, foreign policy should be striving towards common goals. We are facing huge globally existential problems with a pandemic, massive vaccine inequalities, global supply chain issues, looming global climate crisis, and increasing global inequality. These issues are no longer limited to a single geographical area. In increased globalized and interconnected world, separatism is no longer a viable option. From economics alone, China's economy is too deeply integrated into the global economy as both an exporter and importer, consumer and producer. For countries outside of the US, prosperity largely depends on exports and good relations with both countries. As long as great powers compete, conflicts becomes the status quo. It exists perpetually. Aggression and war are bad for everyone. No one wins. Research coming out of a joint study at Durham University and Lancaster University, for instance, showed that the US military is one of the largest climate polluters in history, consuming more liquid fuels and emitting more CO2 than most countries. And military budgets are already overinflated. In 2020, global military spending reached an all-time high at $2 trillion US. Despite the outbreak of COVID, downturn of global GDP, increased job insecurity, and increasing climate crisis. Workers in the world lost about $3.7 trillion in earnings during the pandemic. I mean, that's so much money. I don't think any one individual can conceptualize that much money. Like, I can't, can you? So diplomacy and multilateral cooperation are then key to addressing these issues and de-escalating efforts. As a Lowy Institute article pointed out, China was once cast as the villain of a global climate crisis and was widely blamed for the collapse of negotiations at the summit in Copenhagen in 2009, but now has become an active participant in climate diplomacy. And frameworks already exist for bilateral and mutually beneficial cooperation collaboration, such as the UN's Our Common Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which China has been a vocal advocate for in the international arena. Created within the UN General Assembly framework, SDGs are sometimes seen as a non-Western agenda, with development perceived, I would argue, incorrectly as not relevant to Western countries. But, 70 countries created the SDGs. So it was an incredibly participatory and democratic process in creating. But the US has done little to meaningfully engage with this agenda that has a high level support from China and other global South countries. So beyond diplomacy and high level issues, there's potential for cultural and academic exchange as well. And yet these hawkish anti-China policy alienates young people in this sort of collaboration and cooperation, including Chinese nationals in the US, like students and researchers. And to limit such exchanges, I think would be a disservice to both countries. So when we're mobilizing for shared issues, including things like labor rights, human rights, women's rights, climate justice, disarmament, and nuclear non-proliferation, I think it's crucial that we don't reproduce the discourse that these are uniquely Chinese problems due to some inherent or fundamental characteristic of Chinese people, culture, and government systems. In particular, resisting the Orientalist tradition that the US is the only one who can fix these problems or save Chinese people. Mia Shuang Li, a research associate at the Paul Tsai China Center of Yale Law School, says in an 8J Plus video, "We need to see these as real issues rather than a dystopian cautionary tale, as we did with the mass Chinese dystopian tales I spoke about earlier." Look, I'm not saying this is will be easy to fix, and I certainly don't have all the solutions. But I think if we remember that foreign policy is a reality for Americans at home, especially racialized Americans, especially Asian Americans, it's harder to ignore the problem. And remember, China is not our enemy. And we have common goals that we can work towards. Thank you for listening.
I want to thank Allison. That was an incredible presentation, and I know I learned a lot. And now we're going to turn over to questions. And if you think of a question now, send it to the chat and under Kenny's name. And we will try to get all the questions in we can. Thank you. And Kenny, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I want to reiterate that. Thank you so much, Allison. I really appreciate how all-encompassing it was too, with the historical pieces and just drawing everything in from a bunch of different angles. So the question I have here is from Emily. What would be the biggest impact on stopping anti-Asian hate? U.S. foreign policy, fear of communism/socialism, or the hybrid war? Are we looking at a systemic problem as we are facing with racism in the Black or Indigenous communities?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I think it's all three of those, they all are mutually reinforcing. We can't it is a structural issue. So if you think about the hybrid war, you think about foreign policy, you think about racist perceptions and racist media, they all feed into each other. None of them can be taken individually. So if we're tackling them, I think it just depends, what, from an organizational perspective, some of it is what is your organization best suited to tackling, or as an individual, what is your level of expertise in, for instance, policy or, racial justice mobilizing. So I think that's true across all racial justice movements and, racial justice organizing, that all these things are pieces of a larger systemic structural puzzle that has been built for pretty much like the last 500 years, right? So it's not really one or the other. I think it's all of them.
Oh, I have another question here from Kate. She asks, can you speak about human rights issues in China?
Sure. So, with human rights issues, it's a very complex issue, right? I think some of the problems are being sort of illuminated at the Olympics right now, right? So coming from like a war and peace perspective, I worked for a feminist peace organization when Kabul fell in the summer. And one thing that, the US was really, really insistent on when we were going into Afghanistan was this idea of women's rights and human rights. And if we believed in women's rights, we had to go into Afghanistan. But when the US pulled out of Afghanistan, Afghan women's situation, the women that we worked with in Afghanistan, their situation hadn't really changed that much from when the US went in. So, I think we have to be careful when we're looking at human rights, not to use them to justify aggressive policies, justify militarism, because it really doesn't help the human rights situation, right? when the US was in Afghanistan, they were bombing civilian structures. That wasn't really helping women's rights. When the negotiations happened, Afghan women weren't invited into those negotiations. So we have to be really careful about the way we look at human rights in China. I'm not a human rights expert, so I can't necessarily speak to the specifics of the situation, but from a war perspective, I think we have to be careful about the way that we use these narratives to drive aggression and to drive particular racist narratives on our side. But of course, human rights are an important issue, so we also have to take that seriously. Any other questions?
Yeah, good, great point, Sally. Right now I'm not seeing any, but probably could give it another minute. Takes a second to type too. And yeah, that was oh, okay, here we go. So any suggestions on scholars / researchers to follow and books or papers to read on the subject of xenophobia in Western government policy and media? And can you touch on the idea that a lot of official US criticism of China is deflection or projection of its own misdeeds, such as anti-Muslim actions or exploiting Africa through debt?
Yeah, so in terms of scholars, I listed a few in my presentation. So Yun Ong was one. She gave a really inspiring speech, for instance, at the Camden conference. So that's on YouTube, so I would encourage you to look at that. But actually, if you email me, I can give you a longer list because I can't think of people just off the top of my head. But there's a lot of scholarship out there. And, you know, I think with the anti-Asian racism sort of emerging more on the mainstream media, as of recently, there's a lot more literature, both academic and not, on the topic. So yeah, and in terms of, you know, the US sort of projecting, certainly that's definitely a component of it. And I think, you know, when I was talking about how we sort of orientalize this as a thing that can only happen in China or only happen as a product of an autocratic state, I think that's sort of how the US government is framing these things, particularly if you look at the way that it talked about debt traps in Africa, for instance, with Chinese lending. When you look at the way that structural adjustment decimated African nations in the 80s, that was, you know, given by loans by the IMF and the World Bank, which are, you know, largely funded by the US. So I think there is definitely a sort of, you know, way that we see problems in China as exclusive to them without reflecting on similar things that are happening, you know, within our own borders and that we've done as foreign policy, as imperialist policy throughout history. So I hope that answers that question because there were two parts.
Allison, instead of putting this into the chat right now, I really am wondering if a big part of what's going on right now with China is the fact of Americans especially not understanding how socialism and communism, you know, I think it's a line that is not clearly drawn between the two. I think they intersect. Is pushing a lot of people because we're so afraid of those two things in this country. And we don't really understand how you know, incredibly wonderful it could be if we would look at our existence on this earth as all human beings deserve to thrive. And so therefore, if you look at the systems that we have in this country and the systems that they have in socialist countries, a lot more human beings are thriving in China because of what China has done to lower its poverty rate. And we don't right now have a system that wants to see that happen. It's too small a minority in our country is not looking at everybody thriving. Is that something that you think would be, be really important to get people to understand, especially with China?
For sure. I mean, I think a lot of this comes out of the McCarthy era, right? When communism.
I'm not.
Oops, sorry.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry.
Might be your speaker, Emily.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes out of the McCarthyist era where communism was incredibly vilified, right? To the point that people were afraid of, even being associated with communism because people were getting fired, people were getting like severely punished, incarcerated. And there was this idea of like the Red Scare that I don't think ever went away. So I think that's definitely a huge part of the fear of China, is this fear of communism. And a lot of the way that we see then policies like you were talking about of lifting people out of poverty through like government policies is then sort of ignored. Or for instance, the way that China has dealt with COVID. I saw recently on Twitter, somebody saying that all the precautions they were taking during the Olympics were dystopian, but like, it was just people in like protective gear, people sanitizing common shared areas. So I think the fear of communism and the specter of communism that really took over in the Cold War period, and even before the Cold War period, there was a lot of anti-communist rhetoric being pushed by right-wing groups. I think that has a lot to do with how we perceive China, the fears that we have about the Chinese state. And that's a really good observation that, we don't also in the US have a really good understanding of what communism actually even is. So I think it's really easy for us to just sort of vilify something by saying it's communist. I think one really weird example was when people were calling Elizabeth Warren communist, when she's very clearly not a communist, when you know that what communist policies actually are. So I think, that also sort of alludes to the idea of like us not really being able to understand how the Chinese state operates, and instead just having fear about repression of the communist state. And that's exclusively the lens through which we see the state. So yeah, for sure, our fear of communism plays into this a lot.
All right, let's see. I have another question. You mentioned one action is to challenge the trope of zero sum or something like that. Can you explain what zero sum is again?
Yeah, for sure. So zero sum is sort of this term in international relations and politics. I maybe should have been a little bit clear about it, which basically is if one side wins, the other side loses. So it's like if I had, I don't know, if I have $5 and then I give you $5 and there's no exchange, I'm now $5 poorer, but you're $5 richer, right? So that's what the idea of zero sum is, that I can't win unless you lose and vice versa. So this is often sort of like portrayed, imagined as a very abstract way of the way that states interact with each other. But actually, I would argue that's, largely not true in a globalized world. When we exchange, it's usually an exchange, right? So if I'm giving you $5, you usually give me something in return. And like I said, with the vaccine distribution globally, if you give a country a million vaccines, for instance, 1 million people in that country are vaccinated, and that because of the pandemic is global, it's not like we just lose 1 million vaccines. Actually, we also gain more globalized protection against the spread and the mutation of the virus. So zero sum is like there's only one winner and one loser. Both groups can't win, which I think is a little bit not quite representative of how states interact and operate in modern day.
Another question here. How important is it to bring discrimination against Asians here into our work for Black Lives Matter or Indigenous rights?
That's a great question. I think it's really important because it all stems from the same thing, right? White supremacy, white American dominant, imperial dominance, right? And it all stems from colonial conquest, essentially, from a couple hundred years ago. So I think it's really important because, you know, throughout, especially the mid-century, think of the solidarity between Asian, Black and Indigenous thinkers, especially sort of in the 50s and 60s. There was so much great like feminist women of color doing work in that era as well, crossing those boundaries. And I think that sort of fell apart throughout the 80s, particularly between Asian and Black communities. And then you saw, you know, like the LA riots, there was a lot of racial tension. So I think that the work that we're doing for discrimination against Asians is so important for BLM and Indigenous rights and vice versa. And I think there's so much that we all have to learn from each other, you know, and racial justice is something for, you know, that is really important for all people of color. And all of it comes from the same structural issue of white supremacy. So I think that solidarity is so important. And, you know, I really hope that that's something that we can sort of build even more of it in the coming years.
All right. Another question here. Can you say more about what China has done to bring people out of poverty?
Yeah, so I talked about sort of the 800 million people that have been brought out of poverty. So some of the ways that this has been done is by, you know, economic reforms, and this sort of happened a lot during sort of the 80s and 90s. And some of the ways that this has been done is by, because before like this was all these were happening, China was quite rural, right? Like there's a lot of rural villages and it wasn't as urbanized as, you know, the Western countries are. You had a couple cities, but that was it. So really integrating rural economies into China's economy was huge. Also providing things like, there's just like rural programs that they had that were run at the local level, but by like the federal entity, but they were run at the local level that helped lift people out of poverty. So the documentary that I was talking about earlier, Voices, what's it called? Voices from the Front Lines or something. It was a PBS documentary. It's actually on YouTube, and it's still on YouTube, even though the PBS station took it down. And it explains how these rural programs were implemented and how like ordinary Chinese people were uplifted out of poverty. And I think, you know, when a country that has that many people, that's quite a big feat, because what, a couple billion people, that's a lot of people to sort of address their needs. So lifting people out of poverty and integrating rural economies, and also creating this middle class, right? Like China's middle class is growing so rapidly, and there's a lot of people who are leaving these rural areas and being integrated into the rapid urbanization in areas like Shanghai and Beijing. And then as China's economic growth happens through manufacturing, exporting, and importing, then they can integrate even more people into these poverty reduction programs and uplift even more workers. So I think that's sort of how it's being done.
I sort of had a question too that sort of formulating in my head right now. But I remember hearing a while ago in India, there was one of the largest workers' strikes ever in that area of the world, which is very important. And because of like sort of our sentiment towards China in this country is, you know, mostly negative, and we look towards the negative things as we've talked about in this presentation. I was wondering, have there been any like human rights or social rights victories recently within the last like 20 years in China that we might not know about because of sort of the political climate here?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not a human rights expert, so I'm trying to think as well. So one thing that, you know, is really interesting is that, I can't remember who did it now, but there was a study looking at, you know, young people in China and their perspectives. And one thing that the study noted, it was done in the West as well. So was that on social media, the younger generation, so it roughly overlaps to people born in the 90s. So not really like a millennial or Gen Z kind of overlap nicely. But people in that generation are the most educated that Chinese people have been in sort of like modern history. A lot of people have higher education, even postgraduate degrees. And a lot of people are quite vocal on social media, Chinese social media like Weibo and WeChat and stuff, about feminism and LGBTQ plus rights. So I think there's a lot more of a push to sort of, you know, things like feminism and LGBTQ plus rights being talked about now. So I would say that's like a pretty big win on China's side that we don't hear about here. You know, we don't necessarily hear that there's Chinese feminists and feminist discussions happening within Chinese spaces. And some of that is like probably also a language barrier, right? Like perhaps Chinese feminism doesn't look like Western feminism, or Chinese LGBTQ activism doesn't look like Western LGBTQ activism. So I can't think of specifics for you because I'm not a human rights expert, but I think that is very pointing to what the human rights situation, probably how it's progressing in China, and maybe think how things are getting lost in translation.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions at this time. Were there any other last minute questions that didn't get to me? Anybody who I missed? Give it another minute too. If people have a couple more questions.
Okay, I'm going to just pipe in for a minute, and if a question comes up, that's great. It'll be our last question because we're getting close to the time. You know, I think that, you know, what is going on is human beings all over the globe are being challenged about what really is the best way for human beings to live on this earth. I think, you know, coming from the perspective I come from, which is, I believe socialism is a good way of doing things. And so, you know, I think that what's going to happen as we see things go on is that we're going to have to face the fact of learning what's really valuable in life. What do we really care about? You know, do we care about, you know, everybody having what they need? Or do we think it's more important to just make money? Which to me is a very sad way of looking at life. So, you know, I do hope from what Allison has said is that we will look at countries like China and Russia and Cuba, you know, all of the countries that are trying to go a different model. And I think that's what causes us to have even more anti feelings towards Asian people. And let's face it, the anti-Asian has been going on since Korea, since the Korean War. I mean, you know, and then the Vietnam War. And look at Vietnam. We hardly ever hear about horrible things in Vietnam anymore. And thank goodness the US got out of there and allowed them to have the country that they have, which is a socialist communist country. So that's one thing I think is wonderful about having Allison come and talk about all of this, talk about the things that can help our world be a better world. And so I do really want to thank Allison for taking a Saturday afternoon to sit down with us and help us see the perspectives going on here. And, you know, you can spread the word that we will. RJR does put the recording on YouTube, and we also eventually get it onto our website. So people who might have missed our talk can steer their friends towards that. And I do hope that everybody has a great afternoon. And thank you, Allison, for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for listening.
Okay. And I'd say goodbye.